Hoyoverse decided to give these reactions a big buff in 5.2. And I've recorded some footage before the update, so that in this video I can use it to showcase a side-by-side of what exactly happened to them. And I've also made a few simulations to give you actual numbers on what you can expect in terms of damage increase from 5.1 to 5.2. These reactions are generally called transformative reactions. That's because unlike amplifying and additive reactions, they do not increase the damage of a given hit, but instead provide their own separate damage. Applying Pyro and Electro will not increase the damage of either, but instead give you a separate hit. Overload. Really simple stuff. And without going into unnecessary details, the damage of this extra hit is a multiplication of your level, your elemental mastery, and an extra number called reaction multiplier. And this is what they changed. There are other factors like resistance of the enemy and particular buffs, but they don't matter to understand what happened with the 5.2 update. This is how the reaction multiplier changed. Since these are in the multiplication with everything else, very simply put, increasing Shatter reaction multiplier from 1.5 to 3 means that Shatter is doing double damage in respect to previous versions of the game, at every level and any elemental mastery. I tested this and it checks out. My Sayu in 5.1 at level 90 was dealing 18,000 of Shatter damage when way past 1000 elemental mastery. The same Sayu in 5.2, in the same exact conditions, is dealing 36,000 Shatter damage instead. Or my 100 elemental mastery facial was hitting overloads of 4,000. Now in 5.2 they're simply 37.5% stronger, dealing almost 6,000 damage. And since for all these reactions the calculation is pretty much the same, we can compare them. A reaction like Overload is now doing almost as much damage as Burgeon or a Hyperbloom. Shatter is in fact also on the same power level. Of course, however, this doesn't include many of the nuances that these reactions may or may not have, like how easy it is to trigger them, buff them, or if they have any AoE attached to them. Starting with Overload, the thing with this reaction is that if you ever wanted to trigger it as often as possible, using Elemental Mastery builds, you would need an aura that gets applied very often and the counterpart element to be also applied very often, just not as much to overtake the aura. Characters like Toma and Cookie sound great for an Overload buff, but in reality their kit works very well with Bloom cores, but not as much for reactions like Overload. Reason being is that they have standard internal cooldowns, which is something Bloom cores don't care about. In practice, Cookie will only trigger one Overload every other hit, while being able to trigger Hyperbloom every hit. But regardless, most Overload teams don't want to build Elemental Mastery anyway. I simulated an Overload Shivers Arlecchino team before and after the change. Our team DPS is going up by 0.76%. The Overload buff is the smallest, sitting at 37.5% increase to its own damage. And the stronger your character, Arlecchino in this example, the less impactful the change will be. I think this buff is actually another Shanling kind of buff, since teams where we use Electro-Charged to trigger both Vaporites and Overload at the same time, so-called over-vape teams, are still very common and Shanling is one of the best ways to play them. Double dipping on the Elemental Mastery, we would naturally build for Vaporites. The buff to this reaction might however help teams that were a bit underlooked and just felt like a worse version of something else. Think of a Clorinde teams without Dendro. In 5.2 they will feel a bit better. Now I want to get one point out that I think is important, and that's regarding two very underused reactions. Shatter and Superconduct got the biggest buffs. Shatter doubled its damage and Superconduct tripled its damage. Triple damage is massive, but is it even enough to make it viable or to start building Elemental Mastery? Well, let's see. Superconduct is a reaction that decreases physical resistance by 40% for 12 seconds and it deals AoE damage. The area of its damage has a maximum of 2 hits per enemy within 0.5 seconds. It is very similar to Overload or Swirl in that regard. In 5.1, every time my level 88 facial triggered a Superconduct, it would have resulted in 1082 damage. Now in 5.2, this damage is 3.2k. If I were to max out Elemental Mastery, my facial would go from almost 4000 to 11,000. Now, if you ask me, I don't think this is enough for Superconduct to make it anywhere viable as a very important source of damage. It might be somewhat decent against multiple enemies, but you're still not building for it specifically. It's just a small added bonus now. I had some simulations of Eola and Fremi teams I wanted to showcase, but I simply realized that even in the teams where Superconduct is triggered, it does not happen very often, and forcing it is pretty detrimental for the team's success. The overall damage increase for these teams, while being higher than what we've seen for Arlecchino, is still very low. Maybe in the future we might get a unit that has proper internal cooldown, which triggers Superconduct often and at the same time doesn't have big incentives in building personal damage or other stats. Someone like Fischl, but instead of personal damage we get buffs and maybe some elemental mastery use in the kit. All in all, you're not seeing any big improvement, and besides, the reaction is frankly in a poor state right now. This doesn't change much. I also want to briefly talk about Shatter. Shatter is a reaction that requires you to use a blunt attack on a frozen target. Blunt attacks include things like geo hits, claimer attacks, and plenty of specific other talents. In a way, this is an archaic version of 3-step reactions like Hyperbloom and Burgeon, but unlike them, it is not as rewarding to actually be useful. The only time this buff does anything is when you're playing a physical-based team and some Shatter just casually happens. Fremine with Furina is probably the best case scenario. The buff, however, even if being double of what we used to have, doesn't really make it so that elemental mastery buffs or builds become viable, especially because in teams where Shatter naturally happens, elemental mastery provides very little else, since Fritz doesn't care about it and we're probably playing a physical team anyway. But remember that Superconduct can buff Shatter damage. Finally, teams that actually trigger Shatter as one of the main sources of damage are just meme teams, like Have and Shatter Albedo. But hey, at least now those off-meta teams are a little bit better. And I decided to leave the most messy reaction in the game for last. Electro-Charged has a ton of details that make it kind of complex. It doesn't stop at understanding how much damage it does or whose elemental mastery it uses, but for the sake of analyzing the new changes to these reactions, that's all we need. These two pieces of information. Electro-Charged makes it so that Electro and Hydro coexist on the enemy. Hence why we can technically trigger Overload and Vaporize with the same hit. To go deeper, this reaction consists of ticks of damage that will consume both Hydro and Electro Aura. And to understand whose elemental mastery is used, we need the following. Number 1, the first Electro-Charged tick is attributed to the character that triggers the reaction, whether that's a Hydro or Electro unit. Number 2, the following Electro-Charged ticks are attributed to the character that applied Hydro or Electro last. So if I apply Electro on a Hydro aura, the Electro unit's elemental mastery will be used. However, if before the next tick of damage I apply some Hydro, then the elemental mastery of that unit will be used. This is the reason why the ownership of Electro-Charged is so hard to track. It simply swaps from one character to another constantly. I can give you 2 tricks to make Electro-Charged work better. The most technical one uses another property of Electro-Charged, which is the fact that the reaction can spread to nearby enemies. One of the instances in which this happens is when you apply Electro on a single enemy while a few more are nearby and are affected by Hydro. Since the reaction deals Electro damage but doesn't actually apply Electro, you're simply attributing most of the procs to one single target Electro unit. I know this sounds very rare, but it can apply to many units, we just don't really notice it. Alternatively, the most common ways to actually play Electro-Charged so far has been to either ignore all of this and take it as a minor extra damage source, use overwhelming amounts of one element instead of the other, or finally to simply give everyone elemental mastery, so that whatever happens, the Electro-Charged damage is sustained by some buffs. Number 1 example is probably Sucrose Taser teams. A lot of nice yapping, but let me give you an actual number. I will take one of my Clorinde Electro-Charged teams and simulate it with and without the 5.2 reaction buff. Here are the results. In 5.1, the team was dealing around 106,000 DPS on 2 targets, and out of this, around 10,000 was Electro-Charged damage. Now in 5.2, the damage of this reaction is 17,700, an overall increase of 6.6% in total team DPS. I'm afraid of breaking the simulator going for more targets, but as you can imagine, the difference is smaller against a single enemy and larger against more. But what about a team that focuses more on this reaction? Something like a full 4-star Sucrose Taser team. My team here was dealing 14,000 Electro-Charged DPS, which in 5.1 was similar to my overall swirl damage. Now in 5.2 it changes to 23,000 from Electro-Charged alone. The reaction is seeing quite a decent buff and a new character, but nothing game breaking. Lastly, please keep in mind that any number in this video is not meant to be taken out of context and the resources I'm using are not perfect. The only piece of information that you should take away is how much of an increase these reactions are getting. But again, it really depends. This was just me playing around with my own builds and showing you my results. And considering all these changes together, in my opinion the intent of Hoyo was to just rebalance and update these reactions that felt a little bit left behind, being just minor side damage to a given team. It also makes Elemental Mastery substats in your build have a marginally better value. Overall, I'm really happy that they're even considering making these changes. I hope to have given you some more precise insight on the update and not just a casual discussion. I'm curious to see if anything we didn't think about comes out in 5.2. Please like and sub if you enjoyed my content and want to see more of it. It really helps me out. Hope to see you in the next video.